Hey, what's up, guys? It's Fair20 here, Fair20 live feed. Just cranking through here, making a couple quick little stub videos for people to catch up in case they got behind when we were pushing through there. I made a couple really long tech hours, but I wanted to give some short ones so people can just watch a couple of short videos and kind of catch up and figure out where we are. So. Last thing I talked about was variables, so next thing I'm going to talk about is functions, and then next we'll talk about objects after this. So, functions. Alright, so when I was doing the tech hour, I briefly just showed you, okay, well here's what a function is. So I said, hey, you have a function, you declare it with, function, you give it a name, there's an opening, closing parentheses, some brackets, and some code in the middle. And that's a function. And you can call it by a few different ways. But in this situation, I wanted to actually show you using a function, and basically I wanted to show you how you can use HTML with a JavaScript function real quick to actually do something. So, and I think in a prior video I might have shown you guys this already, but we're just going to do it in about 30 seconds or so, a minute or two, whatever. I don't really keep track of time. I'm terrible at that. So notice here, we're going to go to our HTML page here. And let's look at the button. It looks like button 1 is the one we are examining right now. So remember, with HTML, you have a tag, an ID, and in this case, whatever we put in between our opening and closing brackets will be displayed in a button. So in this case, notice we have a blue button, blue over here in our web browser. So refresh. It's a clickable button. Now let's go over and examine our JavaScript. Now, looking at our JavaScript, we use a line of code here. We go document.getElementById. And what does that do? Well, document, remember from previous examples, refers to the HTML document that we're working in. So it's going to refer to myfirstwebpage.html. And then this getElementById. Well, all these elements here, all these IDs, they're all listed. So we can go and look for them. You can find them. And so it gets each one of those elements. By how? Well, the name that you give it. So basically, whatever name you give it over here, btn1, come over here, notice btn1, and you should see how that works, right? Get the element by ID, btn1. Pretty straightforward. So document, my first web page HTML, because remember, this stuff.js is included right here. Script source equals \stuff.js plus script. Remember, stuff.js? Yeah, we talked about that before. So, boom. Now we have this element right up here. And now we can manipulate this element inside of JavaScript. And what's cool about that is then I can go, hey, I want to access the on-clickability of this element. So, button 1, meaning blue button over here, can now be assigned or bound to a function in this case, my function. So what we do, basically when the button is clicked, you make a function that does something. Talked about that before, but I wanted to kind of step through it and one by one manner here as we go. So yeah, then we function, my function, remember function tells the browser or the interpreter that, hey, whatever is following here is going to be a function, so it looks for a name, or it looks for the opening, closing parentheses there. Or, opening, closing parentheses. I'm sorry. Yeah. So, yeah, what it's going to do is either, if you don't have a name there, then it's just going to be anonymous, just like we have up here. So that's what it's looking for, and then opening, closing brackets, whatever's inside, is going to be the code that is executed when you call the function. So one thing to note is when you bind a function to something like onClick, you do not use the open and closing because you do not want the return value of my function. You just want to bind the call for my function. That's one thing to note. It's important to understand that there's a difference between calling a function with just its name and with parentheses. So please note, calling it this way would give you a value equal to onClick if I was to go return. So that is something I'll show you here in just a second why that's important. So note right now, my function here. This way, whenever you click the button 1, what it's going to do, same thing like we talked about before, but this time it's going to get label 1. Well, what is label 1? Well, it's over here, and this is just a text inside a label. And what are we going to do? Well, we're going to change the style to blue. And I'll talk a little bit more about CSS later. So just note that this will change the style to blue for now. So let's make sure that does that. Okay, save, come over here, reload just to make sure everything's okay, nothing in our console, and click it. Hey, look at that. Text turns blue. And guess what? I made another one so you could turn it red, and basically red and blue, red and blue. And if you reload, then it reloads and changes it back to its original color, black, which is what it defaults as when it loads. Unless you set it to a different color when you first render the page. So there you go. That's like a basic, super simple, super straightforward, how does a function work in JavaScript? When you call it, like we saw, every time you click it, it does something. So every time we click it, it executes this code. It doesn't execute this code right when you first call the web page. It only executes this code when you click. Remember that was done by binding the function to an onClick method. So if you don't understand the binding thing right now, don't worry. I'll go a little bit more into that later, talk about attributes of things, but for now, just understand when I say binding something, all I'm talking about is that when you click on something, it has an action that happens. So there's a reaction to when you click on something, basically. And that reaction is whatever code you assign to it using a function. So you should be able to see that. Well, functions can also do other things. They can return values, and they can call themselves. So at this point, if you're just new to understanding functions, and you're like, okay, well, I get it, I kind of understand what's going on, then okay, good. You might want to stop and kind of play with it right now, and really make sure you understand what's going on before watching the kind of last half here. Because the last half, I'm going to go a little bit farther into it and kind of talk about some advanced things using functions. So one of the first things I'm going to do is we're going to talk about what happens when you call a function inside of a function. Does it mess up? Does it work? Well, it should work, right? Because I already showed you we had an overall function here, kind of our 1 yard, and then I had these little yards, or these little functions that did stuff when we click stuff. So you should note, you should kind of understand, and it should make sense that, yeah, a function called inside a function should work, and that's exactly what we did here. So notice we have a function, and we have function myTimer. But here, you'll notice there's something weird happening. Well, we have var t is equal to setIntervalTimer. Well, what we're doing there is setIntervalTimer is actually it's a function that's contained within the JavaScript library. So what does that mean? Well, a library is just a large group of functions that are predefined. So think of a library that has a bunch of books, and they have a bunch of stories or information already written down in the book. Well, it's the same sense of these functions inside this JavaScript library are already pre-coded for you. They're already done. It's already there for you to use and everyone to use, and browsers recognize that they're there. So one of those is this setInterval. So I'm not going to go into everything that setInterval does, but basically what happens is you give it another function and a value, and whatever the value is however many milliseconds it waits before it calls this subfunction. So I made a subfunction called tTime, and basically what happens here is once you click this button, it's just going to make a crude counter. It will just start counting every 1 second and display it on the screen. And how does it do that? Well, tTime is just given a set interval, and it will just sit here and call tTime over and over and over again. And remember, I told you plus plus on the end of a variable. If you watch the variable session that I did, the last video that I did on variables, I think it was the previous one, that I'll post to this one. I'm not sure if the ordering will be right, but look in my other videos for variable. You'll see a quick explanation for that. But basically, it's going to add 1 to count, and then count is going to be displayed just like I had showed you in that one. So I'll show you how that works. Come over here, and we'll click our timer, and then it should start counting. And yes, there it goes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and just notice it just keeps doing that over and over. So we'll let that keep running. Now I'm going to keep going deeper into variables here, deeper into functions here, and really keep blowing you guys' mind. So we're going to use a function to solve a Fibonacci, well, not solve a Fibonacci, but display a Fibonacci sequence. And so how do you do that? Well, you write a function and you put a for loop in it. If you don't know what a for loop is, don't worry about it. I'm not actually going to explain how to do it, but I'm just showing you how cool functions can be. You can make complex code inside of a simple function call, so that whenever you want to do something, so in this case we have onClick Fibonacci non, so if I come over here and click on this, I should get, this button, there we go, I get 1 and 2, because I have the other console.log here turned off. If I undid this and saved it again, actually you guys will get a better output there, so reload that, and there you go. 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. Well, that can also be solved in a different way. In this case, we use an array, and we just call the function one time, and then it does all of its business. Well, there's another way you can do that, and it's called recursion. And so I just wanted to talk about it real quick, because I think it's important that whenever you introduce a function, you immediately introduce recursion, so that you can miserably destroy someone's life. So if you don't understand that joke, it's kind of funny. You can't understand recursion without first understanding recursion. So I introduce it early. I think it's really important that as soon as you're trying to learn what a function is, learn what recursion is at the same time and make your life easier. What is it? Well, it's really simple. All you're doing is just calling the same function over again inside of itself. You might be thinking, what? You can do that? Well, yes you can, but you have to make sure you put what's called a breakout or a termination condition. And what I mean by that is, notice here that if the number is less than 2, it returns 1. Otherwise, it calls itself over again and then adds its value to itself, doing some mathematics in there to fudge the numbers. And then it properly outputs it. I don't actually have that one displaying right. Let's see. I think the way to do it would be to add... Well, I'm not going to waste time messing with that right now. I don't have it displaying out the value correctly like the other one does, so I can't show you it. But it does work. So pretty much that's recursion in a nutshell. You're just calling yourself over to do a subtask. So it can actually make some code simple, much simpler, much more simple. And why is that? Well, when you get into more complex coding, doing things like, say, trying to find the fastest way to go from one place to another, say in a city. and you're a computer that needs to do that. Well, there are ways that you can recursively do that. So you can look at all the different ways kind of all at once in an extending pattern and be much more efficient than going down each path and then coming all the way back and then going down each path and then coming all the way back and then going down each path again. So that's kind of an understanding of how recursion and why recursion is kind of important. So remember, recursion would not be possible without a function. And what is a function? Well, a function is, like I said, a tidbit of code that is ran when you call it. So notice here, with a Fibonacci function, it's a little bit different than some of the other ones. This one actually has a value in here. So that's the last thing I'm going to talk about before I finish up here. And notice that n is used inside of here a few times. So I put an n up here, and I use it down here, and here, and here again. What's happening there is that's an argument. So functions have these things called arguments or parameters. And so what are those? Well, it's kind of like saying, in order for you to think of it like a safety lock on a bike or something like that, or a lockout switch on a jet ski, if any of you guys know what those are, where you have to put it in order for the thing to work. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. In order for this function to work, it's more of like a better way to think of it is if you had a recipe that needed ingredients. These are like ingredients for this function, if you will. The function kind of being like the recipe. So if I put an argument n, I can use n inside of a function and be okay because I know that someone's going to pass, or whenever you call this function, you are going to provide this value. And if you notice down here in our recursive call down here, don't worry about the recursion part, of course, just note we give it a value in here. We give it n minus 2. And that's kind of the thing about recursion here, is notice we're passing the value back down to ourselves, but we're modifying the value every time we do it. So it changes, but we're still using the original first value that we're given. If that doesn't make any sense, don't worry about it. Just remember that it can be done as simple as this. With a simple log statement, if I pass an n value in here, whatever that n value that I give it will then be outputted in the log. So that's basically an argument in its simplest form. You can have much more complex arguments. You can have objects as arguments. You can have strings as arguments. You can have integer values as arguments. They don't have to be a specific type of argument. It depends on the function that you have, and it's up to you to make sure that the value that someone passes into it is the correct value before you do something with it. So that's an important thing to kind of understand with arguments and functions. Is with Java, it's a little bit more loose than other programming languages with JavaScript, it's a little more loose than other programming languages like Java, where you have to say int or float, value name, and so on and so forth. This, you just give it name, and you can have multiple ones, of course. I could have M, I could have L, I could have whatever, I couldn't have a period there. I could have whatever I want. And then I could use those names then down here. And assign those, and manipulate those freely, and go about my business. So that is just a quick once-over of functions, and hopefully that helps you. It should be pretty obvious now what a function is, how a function works, and you'll start to see the use of function parameters, arguments that can be used in functions, and you'll start to understand how useful those are as you create your own functions and play around with it. So now that I've kind of shown you the basics, I encourage you to go out there and mess around with it. You can, of course, get my code. There's a link to the paste bin, and you can play around with it. And I encourage you to do that. Copy and paste it into an editor, and of course, open it in a browser, and just see what happens when you mess around with it. Add some arguments, pass them in, mess with them, and so on and so forth. But note that, you know what? Actually, before I let you go, I did forget one thing. One thing here. It's this return. That was the one thing when I was down here, I forgot to mention that. So the reason why you can actually do this recursion thing I was talking about, the reason why you have to worry about, remember up here when I told you you can't use the parentheses after this? Well, the reason why you can't do that is because if I wanted to, I could do something like this. I could have a function that, like here, when I called it, I had a variable that was equal to some function, and I would do that. And what would happen is the variable, whatever in this case, s, would gain the value that was returned by calling this function here. And I don't have this function made. I was just using that as an example. So let me make sure you understand that. This return statement, so if I was to actually, I'll go ahead and actually do this, just so you guys can kind of see this. So if I was going to do this, in this case, I would have this properly created, and then all I would do is I would have a return statement in there. I'm just going to return 1 in this case. So what would happen is if I called this function like this, and put the parentheses behind it like that, then whatever value I have here at the end of the return statement is then passed back and given to this s value. So that's a quick little explanation of how the return ability or the return keyword allows you to pass values back out. So remember I showed you how to pass values in. So if I wanted to, I could have a value, excuse me, and I could do this. And so what would actually happen is whatever I passed in here would then be returned and stored in S. So I'm basically making a loop there. Whatever value I put here would then be passed in through here, and then you could access that inside your function, because remember this is the function call, and then all I'm going to do is just return that. So that might confuse you, but that's like a quick loop, and that's kind of a hard thing to understand for people at first, because of like, well, what's going on there? But remember, I talked about in the very beginning, a function's kind of like a fence, and so you need a way to go in and out of that fence, to go in and out of that yard. So inside that fenced-in area where your code is contained, and how you do that is by passing values in and returning values back out. But the catch is you have to be creative about how you return values back, because although you can take multiple values in, it's a little bit trickier, and there's a little bit more style that's required to handle passing multiple values back. So just remember that returning values is just like taking values into a function in reverse. And so that should basically show you everything you need to know about a function and how to use it and how they can work with HTML like I showed you before, by simply doing some cool things like clicking a button and having them store values like I had shown you in the earlier tech hours. So yeah, functions are really handy. They can help you do a ton of complex things. They can make your website or web page or behind the scenes of games or all sorts of stuff. There's so many so many uses. Functions are one of the key things with creating more advanced and more complex code. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there for this one. I appreciate anybody who actually popped in. I don't know if anybody's kind of hanging out. It's really early in the morning, so that's why I'm doing these real quick. So not too many distractions in the chat from people. So thanks for coming by for 20 live stream. Appreciate it. This is for 20. It's been another quick broadcast here, quick session of Tech Hour and talking about JavaScript and specifically functions in JavaScript. So I do appreciate you guys coming and watching my YouTube videos and stuff, and coming and checking out my Twitch channel and hanging out and contributing and stuff. So hopefully you guys, if some of you are behind, this helps you catch up to what we're doing here currently, and you're able to kind of understand what I'm talking about. So it's not too much of a jump if you miss an episode here and there. So yeah, definitely thanks everybody. Appreciate everybody that came out. Everybody, please keep throwing those likes. Please keep throwing those follows. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, of course, and of course find me at www.twitch.tv/Ver20. I'll be doing these tech hours quite regularly, so watch me. You can find my information on there. So thanks, guys. Have a good one, and as always, it's been good. Take care. And I'll see you guys around.